It's fantastic. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited about being here. And what I'm going to try and do over the next sort of 30, 40 minutes is just try and give you some really practical tips about getting published. So as Bronwyn said, I'm the editor-in-chief. Can you hear the screaming in the background? It will settle down. I'm the editor-in-chief of Nurse Education Today, and I've been the editor of different journals now for about 20 years. And I think the first thing I'd say, it's the best professional development that I've ever done. So that's what I'm going to do today. But first, I'm just going to let you all know that I'm in the beautiful city of Bendigo in central Victoria. I'm on Jara country, so the unceded lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people. And I want to acknowledge that I do live on the most beautiful country, I think, in Australia, but there were also some appalling atrocities that occurred very close to my home with Indigenous people. So I do want to acknowledge that sorrow. And I also want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and the wonderful young people that will take Indigenous culture and wisdom forward. So I'm really excited to be here. So what I'm going to do is really talk to you over the next 30 minutes and really step you through what I've learned as an editor. But what I really want you to do is please interrupt me at any point, because I run writing for publication workshops internationally. I'm really used to people just stopping me if they need clarification. So don't think that you need to sit there, quietly and just while I didactically speak to you. I'm really happy for you to stop me, get me to clarify anything, but I'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So what I'm really going to do is really start by really framing this in that many of the issues that I see with publishing, they start right back at the study design stage. And the thing is that when we design a study, and especially when you're new, when you're a neophyte researcher, you have this great idea, it's a problem that you can see, and so you go out and you design your study, you do the study, it's beautifully done, and then when you go to get it published, you haven't sort of really thought lots about how this piece of work is going to end up as a publication. And I think one of the things that really stresses me as a journal, one of the most common comments that I write is that this is a beautifully designed, beautifully written up study, but it actually is not that important because there's a massive knowledge gap. I think that we do have an issue in research of publishing more and more and more work that's hardly ever cited. And it just sits there, and I think as a young academic again, and I think this is a message for doctoral students, this heavy emphasis on publishing more and more and more, rather than necessarily thinking about the quality and why we're publishing. And I always frame it in my head is that even if you're not doing a funded study, you're funded by someone, and that's taxpayers' money. So what we do when our participants fill out, they do an interview with you or they fill out surveys in a quantitative study, they're giving up their time, and therefore ethically it's incredibly important that that work gets published. So the main message at this point I want to talk about is really thinking right back at the study design stage and the things that are really hard to fix when you come to write your publication. Now, one of the things I get people to think about when they're designing their study is when this study's written up, who will cite it? Who will see it as important? Who will want to distribute your knowledge? So it's really important to think about the so what, and I'll come back to that in a little while. So it's really thinking about the knowledge gap. So what's known about your study focus and what does your study add? So many journal articles, I couldn't tell you how many. I manage about 2,000 to 3,000 articles every single year come across my desk. So I read all of those, and I'll tell you about that process shortly. But, the number of articles that I reject purely because they haven't identified a knowledge gap right back at the start of their study is probably the most important message that I want you to take from here. And obviously, that means being able to have a really good handle on the literature, doing a thorough literature search. You don't always have to do a systematic review, but you do have to do a systematic search. So you can clearly identify what are the studies that have been done, what is the knowledge that still remains, and what is the gap that you will address. Because most people tend to think, oh, what fascinates me will fascinate everybody. And it might be a problem for you. You know, I always sort of jokingly say, if I read one more damn article about simulation, you know, it would drive me mad because, you know, there are thousands of articles written on simulation. There are still important questions around simulation. But it's not about, you know, students' experience or students' views of simulation. That's been done to death. So it's about really being clear about that. And also, when you come to write your beautiful manuscript, you need to be able to clearly show what the knowledge gap is, rather than just saying, this was something I found interesting. So it's about thinking right at the start of the study, is the methodology and method right for the research question? Because one of the things that's always troubled me as an academic, and I hear many people say, I've got a colleague that describes herself as a methodologist, and that's fantastic if she's got extensive experience in that methodology, but it doesn't mean that every single question aligns with that methodology experience. And so what I mean by that is it's about thinking really long at the start to say, what is my question? Because you can frame questions in different ways if you want to use the specific methodology. But I don't believe that methodology or method comfort should drive your study. It should be the research question, and then it's about what's the best fit for that. Because I see people, and I think that sort of lends itself into my next point about sample size. I see people doing that all the time where they, I don't believe that a sample size can be too small or too large. It needs to be right for the question. So if you're asking a big question, you need a big sample size. You know, if it's something really focused, a small sample size might be appropriate. So it's really thinking about the methodology and the method. Now, the other thing that confuses everybody, I would really encourage you to totally get your head around the difference between methodology and method. So methodology is the theory, method is what you actually do. So to give you a quick example, phenomenology is a methodology, and then there are methods that you would use in phenomenological research. But I get people being really quite confused about the two. So that really goes right back to the study design stage. Have I got the right methodology, method for the research question? I see that this is often done really quite sloppy, and another reason why I reject a lot of papers, particularly in qualitative research, where they say, I used a qualitative design. Now, yes, it might have been a qualitative design, but what's the theoretical underpinnings of that study? Because that really determines the lens that you're putting on your project. And the reader wants to know about, particularly in qualitative work, the lens that you used, because in qualitative work, it's about interpretation, and you interpret it through that theoretical lens. And I'm happy to take some questions on that later. So, the best professional development I ever did was when I was a very young academic many years ago. And I was probably a doctoral student actually, or about probably that stage. And I went to this fabulous writing workshop by a man called Robert Brown. Now, this material is really old now, but it really just spoke to me at the time. And I think it's a great guide, because I'm a great believer that if you're going to write a journal article, you need a plan. And if you think about this as you're working through your study or your review, it really helps you get crystal clear about what it is you're doing. Now, again, I'm a bit of an impatient writer, so I think, writing plans takes too much time. But I think being able to put together, and I use Robert's work still, it's about really trying to think about who are you framing this article for? Who are the intended readers? Who's going to read my work? It's about what you did, why you did it, what happened, what do the results mean, etc. I'm not going to read all of those. But what I try and encourage people when I run writing for publication workshops is to start with this as a little list and have a go at filling that out in 50 words. Now, you won't waste that because you move that straight over into your abstract anyway. But it's about being really clear about that. Now, what Robert, if you go to his blog, and as I said, it's really old now, but if you go to that, the things that he always says is that the most common error is that people focus so much on what they did, and number 4, what happened. Now, as an editor, I skim over what you did and what happened, meaning your results and findings. I don't tend to spend a lot of time on those. What I look at really is, what do your results mean? Now, I think when people are, still learning how to write, the fallback position is to spend a lot of time on your manuscript, is putting your stats in beautiful tables, producing fabulous quotes and writing a beautiful findings and results section. But rather than thinking about why you did it, rather than what you did, and what the results mean. So what the results mean to theory and practice, and the key benefits and what remains unresolved. And I would say, working as an editor, that the majority of people really do fabulous jobs on describing their method and their findings. But what often is done really poorly is those other bits that I think are the most critical. And the reason I say they're the most critical, because that's your contribution to new knowledge, being really clear about how you take the findings from a study, which are great, but then interpreting them about what they mean for practice, for policy, for education, or whatever that may be. So I really get people to think, when they're learning how to write a journal article, because there is a formula that can be learnt by everybody, and that is to really think about those things. Now, some of this will be really basic, especially for those of you that are well published, but identifying the journal that you want to publish in. I think it is an absolute waste of time to actually write a manuscript and then start to think about where you might slot that manuscript. I always encourage people to start with, where is this manuscript aimed at? And the first thing you do is interrogate the scope of the journal, and you interrogate the author guidelines. Because again, one of the main reasons I reject papers is they're out of scope. Now, what's happened is the person has wasted their time, because journals can often be slow. So it might be 4 weeks before I get a manuscript that's submitted to actually consider it as an editor. And in that 4 weeks, I just send you a quick email back to say it doesn't fit with the scope of the journal. And it would really surprise you how many people don't really read the author guidelines and go through them really clearly and have a look at what sort of things are normally published by that journal. So the best example that I would give you is from my own journal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Nurse Education Today. People will often pick up that education piece and they will send journal articles about patient education or educating consumers. And that's clearly out of scope for the journal. So it's about being really clear on that. I think it's about identifying a recent article because of changing editors. Now, what I mean by this is that every editor that takes over a journal will bring their own views, their own focus to what it is that they think is important to publish. Or some of the, there can often be idiosyncrasies that different editors might have. So I'll give you an example. One of the editors that was in charge of a major journal would never publish an article that used phenomenology and focus groups. Now, we could have a whole theoretical debate about that, but she believed that the individual lived experience was incompatible with focus group methods. So you may not agree with that, but looking and being really clear about what the sort of flavour of the journal might be under that editor is really important. And if you're ever worried about that, I get lots and lots of emails from people that will say, I'm thinking about doing this and writing this for your journal. Would this be in scope and would this be something that's of interest? And I don't ever mind getting those because they save a lot of time for everyone. So if ever in doubt, just flick the editor a quick email. I always reply to those really quickly, or I try to. So what happens when your paper is submitted? So I'm just going to talk you through this for a few minutes and then I'll move on and I'll sort of really get down to the nuts and bolts of each bit of your manuscript and what you should do. So I received a manuscript from the editorial staff, and the first thing I do is I look at the title. And I'm going to talk about titles in a little while, but usually I can tell now, and look, I suppose I'm pretty experienced now. As I said, I look at about 3,000 manuscripts a year. I can usually tell in 2 minutes whether that manuscript is going to be in scope for the journal and whether it will be reasonable. And I'll come back to that. So I look at the title, I read the letter to the editor. Now, one of the things that I didn't realise until I became an editor was how important that letter to the editor is. So I used to write letters to the editor that says, dear editor, please, I've just submitted my manuscript and I look forward to hearing from you in due course. I would never tell anyone to write that sort of a letter anymore. What I want as an editor is I love the letters where somebody sends me and they say, this is the study that we have done. This is what's known in this area. This study addresses this gap, and this is why you should publish it. The minute I saw a letter like that, that straight away triggers to me, there's a fair chance this is going to be a really good manuscript. So that's the first thing for me. Because one of the things, and I'm being very honest here, if I'm managing about 50 papers each day, I don't have an hour for every one of your paper to read. So you need to be super clear for me to make the decision whether this is going to go to review or whether I'm going to reject it. So if you put really concrete, so going back to the Robert Brown things, you could use those sort of guides, the 50 words of each, in your letter to the editor to clearly show me why your study is important, the knowledge gap that it's addressing, and why we should publish it. So that's a tip. We cross-check reports. Now, people are so silly. You can run your work through plagiarism detection software yourself. I really don't know why people don't do that. Because the first thing we do is run it through that. And our software is really sophisticated, picks up huge amounts of things. It would shock you the numbers of papers that I will reject because they're too similar to other works. And these are from experienced writers. Run it through the plagiarism checker yourself. An alert to supervisors and students. When you submit a paper and your name is on that publication, you are standing behind the ethical conduct of that research. Now, I'm not saying doctoral students may be slack with, not paraphrasing correctly, but I've seen it happen with my colleagues that have written a section and it's too close to the original. So as a team, we always run them through plagiarism software and we get the report to make sure that every bit of that manuscript is right. Because if there is a major problem with it, you can't step back as an author and say you didn't know about it because you've signed off to say that you stand by the content of that manuscript. So really important. Now, what's in our system now, which is really sort of super cool, is that it flags similar papers. So it doesn't only flag sort of where the text might match exactly, it flags papers that have been submitted before that it might have been rejected. So people will be really silly because I think we forget or we don't keep an eye out on those things. They'll write a paper, we'll reject it, and then 6 months later, the paper will be resubmitted unchanged. Now, that immediately comes up as an alert with my system to say it's a previously rejected paper. So when I look at your paper, I make a decision: the immediate editor rejection, to transfer to another journal. So sometimes I will transfer it to another journal that's more similar and more suitable. I'll send it to review, or I'll send it to an associate editor, somebody who works for me, because I don't manage. I'm the person, I'm at the top of the pyramid. I see every paper, but then I split them out to a group of associate editors that help me, and they're fabulous. Now, the most common reason, so I would reject 90% of manuscripts that are submitted to our journal, about that, maybe not that high. Over the course of a year, we'd have about 3,000 journals, manuscripts that come in. We would end up publishing about 300 of them. Now, what's important with that is, as an editor-in-chief, my reviewers are precious resources. I'm sure you are all being driven mad by being asked to peer review 50 million papers. I'm getting 6 a day, that I just don't have time to. So as an editor, and this is where every editor is different, but I would much prefer to spend time on a paper, reject it before I waste the time of a reviewer. So my sort of bar is there a very good chance that this manuscript is going to end up being published? That's my bar. And once the papers, when we look at our stats, it's pretty good, actually. I must do okay, because once you get to review with Nurse Education Today and many other journals, you will then be in a situation where you will probably get published, because the predatory journals and some of the journals that aren't high quality will just send everything to review, and they've got really high rejection rates. But I would much prefer to have a high rejection rate at my desk, which is why the tips I'm going to give you hopefully will be helpful. So common reasons for rejection. I'm not going to read all of them, because I'll send you my slides. Everyone can have them. I'm happy for them to be distributed. But for an international journal, limited to a single country where it's not transferable. So what I mean by that is where you've conducted the study in Australia, you write all about the Australian context, but you don't draw out the learnings for the rest of the world. So you're really concentrating on just Australia. Now, that, if you think back, that's why identifying that knowledge gap is so important, because if you're meeting a knowledge gap, it's not just an Australian knowledge gap, it's an international knowledge gap. So what you need to do if you're doing a country in a single population, single country, is indicate really clearly why that's transferable internationally. Now, what I encourage writers to do is, when I work with people in workshops, people think that the more complicated the writing is, the more intelligent you sound. I definitely did that when I was a new academic. Now I've realised that the simpler you can be and the more direct you can be in your manuscript, it just, not only does it set the signpost for your readers, but it also makes the editor's job easy, the reviewer's job easy, and then ultimately your message is much stronger. So what I would do is, for example, using a sentence that says, while this study has been conducted in Australia, these key learnings, XXX, are transferable to other settings, and explain how and why. People often shy away from writing really direct sentences. The contribution of this study to new knowledge is being really, really, really clear. So I've already talked about limited contribution to new knowledge, write it all the time. Lovely study, beautifully written manuscript, but it doesn't address a knowledge gap. You haven't identified what that gap is. In other words, write me a really good lit review so I know. And at the end of that literature review, just before you funnel down into the method, be really clear. Sentence in your manuscript that says, this is what is currently known, this is the gap, this is what this study addresses. Super clear. So journals are interested in citations. So the other thing is that work's not going to be cited if it's not contributing to nothing, anything new. Like, who's going to cite a paper that you might be interested in, but there are another 200 articles written in the same area? So I reject them because they're not likely to be cited, which links back to that knowledge gap. Now, the other thing that would surprise you, shock you, is how we get so many papers that the level of typographical, grammatical errors, you can't proofread your own work. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But the amount of typos, and, the first thing to get, I'm pretty balanced, but the first thing to get an editor off site is to open it up and there's a typo in the title. Because straight away I just think, oh my goodness, this is so sloppy. But, we all make mistakes. I type mistakes. If you read any of my manuscripts, they're full of typos. And that's why you need to share them, get other people to read them, really get somebody else to edit your work, because it's just amazing, the avoidable errors. And the breaches of publication ethics, similar papers, text recycling. And I'm going to come back to that at the end, because I want to just give you a couple of key tips about the really complicated issue of salami slicing and how you manage that. So I'll come back to that at the end. So what I'm going to do now is really just talk about the increasing your chance of getting past the editor's desk. So I've been the editor-in-chief for a long period over 2 major journals, and I was an assistant editor before that. So it's about 20 years of sort of watching what happens. So be really clear about the scope of the journal and your manuscript. I've already said that. Your letter to the editor. It's not enough in any study to say this study hasn't been conducted in Australia. Years ago, when they were building, particularly in nursing, when an evidence base was building, people were replicating studies across all different countries. That's not appropriate anymore, just to say that's your gap in knowledge. It is appropriate, however, so it's important to listen to what I'm going to say now, is that if you are conducting your study in a different geographical setting, and it's important, is to describe why that geography is important. So it's not just because the study hasn't been conducted in Australia. There's something about the context of Australia that's important that this study should be conducted here. So that's really important. So it might be, I'm trying to give you a really concrete example. It might be that there's been a study trialled with in high-income countries, and that the authors, there's lots known about that, but it hasn't been done in this country. And the reason why it needs to be done in this country is because of this. So explaining what's so different. And then thinking then about, if you're going to sort of argue that the study needs to be done in your country, then what will be the broader learning? So to be able to say, the study hasn't been done in a low-income setting, and doing this study here is important because the context is different and the learnings will be applicable to other similar low-income countries, if that makes sense. Now, as I said, incredibly pedantic. You can't proofread your own work. Don't even try. Send it to somebody, a trusted friend, a trusted colleague, and ask them to do it for you. I think one of the things that I learned a lot too through my research career, I've been a professor now for maybe 10 years, been an academic for over 25 years, is got to develop a thick skin. Water off a duck's back. As much peer review, as much review that you can get on your manuscript, the better. And, I really push people to have internal peer reviews in their own organisation, in their own group. So not the people that have written the manuscript, getting somebody else to peer review it. The same you might for a grant, and editing it, because you can't edit your own work. It's really hard. And as I said, consider running all papers through plagiarism detection software. You can run them through, the same way you would a student paper, and just triple check them. So now I'm going to talk to you for a couple of minutes about title. Now, I've just written an editorial about this. So once I've sent that off to the journal, they'll publish it. And when I get to the end, I'll tell you how to sort of follow what I'm doing on Twitter. Is the title's incredibly important. I dislike creative titles. I hate them. If you go and look at my CV, you will find creative titles when I was a brand new academic, because I'm creative, I'm artistic. I'd come up with the grooviest title ever. You will never see that on my CV now, and I'm embarrassed by my early papers. The reason is because they have to be search optimized. Google cannot find your creative title. Your creative title means that your paper will never be discovered. It will be impossible to find for a systematic review, and it won't ever get cited. So if you're writing a creative title, I will send it back to you and ask you to please change the title. So Jarks and Seber say that well-cited articles have clear titles that describe the study or its findings. If you look further down, they also say the presence of a colon separating two clauses is positively correlated with higher citation rates. Now, what that means, what I love, so if you put a colon in your title, your paper will get cited more. Now, the reason is there's also, if you read up a bit to Habs, I can't pronounce that, but those great authors, if you put the study design, the methodology, or the methods in your title, you're more likely to be cited as well. So if you think about that colon and a detailed title, your title might be, you might have the title, colon, a randomized controlled trial. Or you might have the title, colon, a systematic review. And the reason is because focusing on that pushes your article up in Google searches, means you'll be found. Never put the country in the title. Now, people always argue with me about this, but I can tell you now there is bias with reviewers and also some of it is racist bias, I believe. So if I look for reviewers for a paper that is written in non-white, non-Western countries, geez, I struggle to get reviewers. If the title's not there, reviewers are much more interested. Interestingly enough, and I'll be a little bit controversial here, it's really hard to get anybody to review anything where, you've said a US study or an Australian study, because they don't think it's relevant to their own work. The other thing is, I've got a little citation here, and I've got the article at the end if you're ever interested in reading it. But also, your articles won't be cited and they won't be read if the country's in the title. So there's been a number of bibliometric studies that have been done that show that country in the title, people don't bother reading it because you're arrogant in the US. You don't think there's anything important to read from Australia. You're arrogant in Australia. You think you know it all. You're not going to read a US study. Leave titles out. Now, I always get people to do this when I run workshops. Put your proposed title into Google before you submit it. Type it in, see what comes up, have a look. Get your keywords and run a search in a database. So this is before you submit your article. Think about what your keywords are and actually whack them into a search engine database and see what you find. Really try and test that to see whether your title and your keywords are going to bring up similar articles and similar research in your field. Because it's not just about the publication on your CV, it's about your track record in terms of citations and you being able to write on your grant application that your journal article has been cited 500 times. So run all of that before you submit the article to really think about your title and your keywords. Keywords are incredibly important because the other thing is for lazy editors like me who are busy, your keywords will help me find the appropriate reviewer for your work as well. So if you, for nurse education today, if you simply put in a keyword that says nurse education, that means I've then got to go and do all of the work then to actually find out who might be the most appropriate person to review your work. So really think about that as well. Now, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about abstracts because, as I said, you can have my slides. And so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on this. But thinking about your abstract as a set of questions, and remember, that's going to be the first thing I'm going to read of yours. Now, 90% of people, when I challenge them in writing workshops, finish their manuscript, they don't think about the abstract and they bang an abstract out 2 minutes before they submit. So they just throw something together because they've spent all the time on the manuscript. I love Christina on the left-hand side who says an abstract, you need to spend about 30 minutes of writing followed by 30 hours of unwriting. What she means is that your abstract is incredibly important. Now, I think what you do is you frame your abstract as a series of questions aligned to each heading. Now, what I see people do all the time, it drives me mad, in methods, they actually will not write what the method is. They'll put all this other information in there that's not important. The background, they'll write all this sort of stuff almost preempting what their results are, rather than being really clear about what is the problem that you're seeking to address. So to only answer what's asked, if you're given some headings to write under, now if your abstract is unstructured, put the headings in anyway and take them out to submit. But, only write what's asked. And, people say, but I've only got 200 words for an abstract. Yep. So don't put all the superfluous detail in there. What is your problem statement? This is the problem. This is the aim. This is the methodology and methods that I did. And instead of actually being vague with your findings, I see people do this all the time. They'll write, the findings are discussed in this article. No, what are the key findings? That's what people want to know. And with your conclusion, what do the results mean? Now, hopefully you've cottoned on that the work that I talked about doing with Robert Brown, getting those 50 words clear, will also come straight over into your abstract here. So you haven't wasted that plan right at the start. And again, lots of feedback on your abstract because that's critically important. When you think about when you do a systematic review, you do all that screening of abstract. You reject papers on abstract, title and abstract. That's why the title and the abstract are so important to be super clear. Okay, what I look for in the main body of the manuscript. So, have the authors identified the key literature? So we've talked about that. Is there a clear problem statement or question? So I want people to write, the research question in this study was X, or when you funnel down before you get to your methods section, right at the end of your literature review, this is the problem that this study will address. So super clear. I am skim reading your manuscript, so I'm looking for that. If I can't find that, then I will write back. There needed to be a much clearer statement of the problem and the research question. Good luck with publishing elsewhere. So is there a clear aim? Now, the other tip that I'll give you is make sure your aim's the same all the way through. That sounds really basic, but I actually highlight aims and I check to make sure they're the same because people are often not consistent. Now, again, this will be topical. I'm sure I'll get a question on this. A scoping review. So I reject 90% of scoping reviews now. The reason I do is because scoping reviews, a few years ago were the flavour of the month. There were lots of them published. There was that great work of Arksy and O'Malley. And so people started to think that scoping reviews are really suitable for all sorts of reviews when I don't want to go to the effort of doing a systematic review. The problem with scoping reviews is that they're designed for a specific purpose, and that is to map the evidence base when little is known. So if it's an evidence base where there is quite a lot of literature, then you're not really mapping the evidence in a field that's unknown. You really should be doing a systematic review. And I'm sure I'll get a couple of questions about that. Now, the other sort of tip that drives me mad, I reject a paper straight away. And that is where, constantly it drives me mad. People are in their methods section say that they use the PRISMA guidelines as the method for their study. It's not a method, it's reporting guidelines. It's fine to say in your abstract that your study is reported using the PRISMA guidelines, but it's not a method. So it's actually about, that's another reason. Like I would probably reject, I rejected 2 yesterday who were describing the PRISMA guidelines as a method. Is the sample appropriate for the question? Massive confusion. Another one that all sorts of people make mistakes on is purposive and convenient sampling. If you are sampling a group of nursing students to address a nursing question, that's not convenience. They're not convenient. They're purposive. You're sampling them to be information rich. So is the analysis well described? With qualitative work, neophyte researchers, people who are new to publishing, I remember I did it as a new author. I remember arguing with somebody, I wanted my participants' voices to come through. So all these quotes, yes, but your participants could just write that. Your job is to interpret it. So you need to, studies, qualitative studies where there are millions of quotes with tiny little bit of joining sentences, I send them back and say, I'm really sorry, you haven't done enough analysis here in terms of interpretation. Discussions, I'm working with authors from a low-income country where I'm trying really hard to get them published and trying to get them to move beyond simply restating their results and findings in a discussion section. It's what it means. Go back to Robert Brown. What does it mean? Not what you found. What does it mean for policy, practice, education? And again, my experience is people write conclusions in the last 2 minutes before they submit. And then what we end up with is these really poorly written conclusions. I want to be left with, that was fabulous. So in summary, I look at the aim, I look at the methods, I don't read your findings or results. A reviewer can do that for me. I don't do that. I look at whether you've clearly said you've made a contribution to new knowledge. I look at your abstract. I skim read your discussion and I read your conclusion because I want to know, okay, how punchy is this at the end? Now, what I'm going to do is, okay, I'm going to do 1 minute on this, then I'm going to stop and I'm going to take questions. So what's really important when you design your study is that you, right back at the study design stage, is that increasingly the concept of salami slicing is under the microscope for all journals. Now, what I'm going to tell you now might shock you a little bit, but a lot of what I do as an editor, I deal with complaints, I deal with legal issues. I have to retract papers all of the time. So you will be a very naive author that will publish around your theme of your qualitative study, and you'll write it up as a study, and then you'll try and publish another article where you're publishing on the second theme, and then you'll think, oh, that's all fine, and then some bright-eyed PhD student, many of them are the ones that report, are doing a systematic review, and they find your 2 papers and they put a complaint into me, and this is true, this happens a couple of times a month. They put a complaint into me about salami slicing a study. They say, I've looked at this is the same research question or similar, it's the same sample, but they're reporting it in 2 different papers. Don't do it. Don't do it. The important thing to think about in the design of your study, if you want to produce multiple publications from your study, the best way to do that is to phase your study. and to be able to publish different phases. I had somebody send me something when and often authors are really honest. So I rejected a paper yesterday where the authors wrote, this is the pilot findings from our qualitative study, mixed method study. It's a mixed method study. And these are the pilot findings from our qualitative study. The quantitative study will be published in a later publication, and our final findings will be published in a later publication. I sent back a grumpy email and said, do you realise that I was nice, but you are breaching all sorts of ethical standards here. Now, the other thing is, don't do it too. Don't try and slice up all these papers, because what you're doing is you're slicing up your citations. So what you want to do when you're applying for an NHMRC grant or a big grant and somebody asks you what are your top 5 publications, you want the maximum citations for each of your publications, not dilute your citations across a number of papers. Methodologically too, if you're clear on your methodology, you know that you never publish the findings of a mixed method study because the hallmark of mixed methods, theory-wise, is mixing of data. So why on earth would you publish it? If you want to do that, you publish it as a multi-method study that's different phases with different research questions. Now, what I'm going to do is stop there. I'm going to tell you that I regularly tweet writing and publishing tips at Nurse Education Today. That's the Twitter handle for the journal. And if you jump on there, you'll see that what I do is often when I'm reviewing articles, when I've got some time, anything I can see in that article or I think about, I tweet. So if you go back through those, you'll see some of my other tips. But I hope that's been helpful. Now, if I stop sharing, then what I'm going to do is pick up, reviewers and editors often insist in the country being in the title. If they insist on that, I would respond back to them in your letter to the editor. I would cite the articles at the end of my presentation today, and I would say that you are not putting the country in the title because you believe that it impacts citation rates and there is evidence to support that. Anybody that really insists on that are very inexperienced reviewers and editors who don't understand. So that's that question about country title. Should be concise, to be in the fallback topic, method, a systematic review, a country in which the study was conducted should not be named into the title. Yes, great point. That's so true. I think that that's really helpful. Now, I'm just going to open the floor now if you want to ask me some questions.
Not a question, Amanda.
You're all silent. Have I bored you?
Oh, they're probably all eating their lunch or moving campsite for those who were at the beginning of the presentation. Yeah. Thanks so much. Wonderful presentation. And I wanted to say that I too am a Bob Brown devotee, that I did one of Bob Brown's writing for publication workshops as an HDR student. So my supervisor, Trish Davidson, organised for Bob to, he's from Brisbane actually, I think, to come down and run a 2-day writing for publication workshop. So the tips that I learned have, held me in good stead, I think. But it was about titles and not about country or anything like that. But one of the things that I've read is that the keywords to maximise the searchability of your of your paper, the keywords, which are actually really critical, should be in the title within the first 60 characters of the title.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, that's correct. And so I think that it's really, you've got to think about how the Google algorithms work. So what you want is you want a title. And that's why, as I said, I get people to spend when I do, and I draw on Robert's stuff when I do writing for publication workshops, but to really come up with a whole lot of titles, spend the time, shove them into Google and see what happens. And that allows you to really move those words around to figure out what's going to come up. When you put your title in, what does it find? Does it find similar stuff, or does it find stuff that's not relevant? Because even though your paper's not yet published, if you stick your draft title in, it will bring up other things, particularly in Google Scholar. And so you want to find that if I stick it in, does it bring up an article that's very similar topic to mine, or it's got the same focus? So it's really to think about when the systematic review is being done, or when someone's searching the literature or wants to cite you, how quickly will they find you? I've got a good question here. No, I don't believe. Now, remember, all editors are different. So if you're going to send an article to my journal, it's not okay to report the survey results separately from the interview result in mixed methods research. And the reason is because I'm a methodologist. I've had lots of training around mixed methods. And the hallmark of mixed methods is mixing of the data. So you need to take your qualitative component, your quantitative component, and you need to report them together, what that means. So if you want to do that, don't call it a mixed method study, call it a multi-method study. And then the first stage was this, the second stage was this. Does having a novice versus an experienced author on the authors list have an influence? No, not at all. In fact, I can tell you absolutely hand on heart, I never even look who the authors are. I'm too busy. I look at the manuscript. I don't actually go into the title page. I can't see that unless I go in and open the file. I simply look at the manuscript. Makes no difference whether you are totally novice. I think that what's really important is to think about authorship, and I had that on my slide. So the most important thing to think about is, have people made a substantial contribution to be an author on your paper? So I sent a paper just back the other day, and it was a good paper, but we didn't believe, I got my co-editors to have a look at it, to have a look at whether we believed everybody had met the criteria for authorship. And we didn't believe they had. So under the Australian guidelines, if you haven't read it, read the NHMRC, I can send it through to you, the NHMRC guidelines for research. There's a really good piece in there that says what you need to be able to do to be an author. So you need to really have substantial, that's a really important word, substantial. So just getting somebody to edit your paper and then including them as an author is dangerous. The reason it's dangerous is because when you agree to be an author for a study, you are standing behind the ethical conduct of that study. So if somebody says to you, can you edit my paper and I'll add you as an author, say no. Because if something goes wrong with that study or that paper and you end up in court, you can't stand behind that. Is it true that editors prefer that you cite works from their own journals? No. No, I don't. I don't ever look at a reference list either. I don't. I can honestly say that. No, because the impact factor is calculated sort of a little bit differently too, in that the way they calculate impact factors, there's sites within the journal and then there's sites outside the journal. So no, don't do that. Don't do that. And I also don't accept reviewers that say they want papers, they want people to cite them unless it's totally relevant to the work. So now I'm aware you'll all have to run. I'm really happy for you to email me. So my email address is on the slides. I'm happy for you to engage with me on Twitter at the Nurse Education Today website. And I'm really happy to, chat to you. If you want to get in touch, make a time, if you need a hand, I can do that. So thank you so much for your patience. Lovely to see all your comments. That's fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And thanks, everybody, for attending today. And I've popped some information into the chat for you, but I'll let you get on to your 1 o'clock meeting. So thanks again, Amanda. Thanks.
That's great. No problems at all.
Okay. Bye, everybody.